be sitting here speaking on behalf, celebrating his death. I would always thought I'd be celebrating his life.
This was the funeral footage of the Bolognia family massacre back in 2008, and at the time, nobody could have imagined something like this would happen to them. But because of one deadly assumption, 3 members of the same family were killed in just seconds. What followed became one of the most controversial cases in San Francisco history, because even though there was a clear suspect, many people still questioned who was truly responsible in a case like this. Was it only the man who pulled the trigger? Or should the system also share some of the blame when there were multiple chances to stop him before innocent people lost their lives? As this story unfolds, keep that question in mind, because by the end of this video, I really want to hear what you think. Tony Bolognia was the definition of a San Francisco local. Born in 1960 and raised in the city, San Francisco wasn't just where he lived. It was part of who he was. He graduated from Balboa High School, stayed close to his community, and built a life centered around family, hard work, and showing up for the people around him. The people who knew Tony all seemed to describe him the same way: dependable, the kind of man who didn't need attention or praise to do good things. On weekends, he coached youth basketball and baseball, not because it looked good or because someone pushed him into it, but because he genuinely cared about kids in the neighborhood. During the week, he worked nights as a shift supervisor at Draeger's in San Mateo. It was demanding work, long hours and tiring shifts, but somehow he still made time for his wife and children every single day. Tony's wife, Danielle, had roots in San Francisco too. They had known each other for years before getting married in 1987. By the time 2008 came around, they had built a family together with 4 sons and the kind of everyday life that feels ordinary until you realize how meaningful it really is. Their oldest son, Michael Bolognia, was 20 years old. He had graduated from Abraham Lincoln High School and was attending College of San Mateo. Like most people his age, he was still figuring life out. But there was momentum there, plans, goals, the feeling that adulthood was just starting to open up in front of him. Friends described him as energetic and optimistic, someone who still had his entire future ahead of him. Then there was Matthew Bolognia, 16 years old, still in high school, still at that stage of life where your parents are your safety net, where rides in the car with your dad feel normal and forgettable in the moment, even though years later, those tiny memories become the ones you wish you could relive forever. The youngest son involved that day was only 11 years old. Because he was a minor, his identity was protected during the investigation and trial. He survived the attack, but survived is a complicated word when you witness something that devastating as a child. The Bolognia family wasn't rich, they weren't famous, they weren't connected to gangs, crime, or anything remotely dangerous. They were a working-class family who spent Sundays together at barbecues, worried about school and work schedules, and lived the kind of quiet life millions of families live every day. There was absolutely nothing about them that should have placed them anywhere near violence.
Along with top city and religious leaders, all came to say goodbye to a father and his 2 sons who were gunned down on a San Francisco street. Meanwhile, police say that their investigation into this case is far from over. KTV's Rob Roth live tonight in San Francisco with more. Rob?
Well, Garcia, police say even though a suspect is in custody here at the Hall of Justice, their homicide investigation into that triple homicide has not let up. Investigators are looking at whether anyone else may have been involved.
On the other side of this story was Edwin Ramos. Ramos was born in El Salvador in 1986 and spent most of his childhood being raised by his grandmother. In 2000, when he was 14 years old, he came to the United States on a temporary visa to live with his mother and siblings in California. But when that visa expired, Ramos never left. What happened next would later become one of the most controversial examples of systemic failure in San Francisco's criminal justice and immigration policies. In October 2003, Ramos, who was only 17 at the time, boarded a San Francisco Muni bus and violently assaulted a man, beating and kicking him. Police arrested him and charged him with assault along with gang-related offenses. Authorities already identified him as being connected to MS-13, one of the most violent and feared street gangs in the world. But despite the seriousness of the attack, Ramos received probation through the juvenile court system in April 2004. Only 4 days later, he was involved in another violent crime, this time attacking a pregnant woman and her brother during an attempted robbery. He was convicted and sent to Log Cabin Ranch, a juvenile detention facility run by the city, but the sentence lasted only from June 2004 until February 2005, roughly 8 months. Then he was back out again. For a moment, it looked like Ramos was trying to turn his life around. After his release, he attempted to apply for temporary residency status, but federal authorities denied it after confirming he was living in the country illegally. So Ramos married a U.S. citizen and applied for permanent residency through that marriage. He even took a construction job. On paper, it looked like rehabilitation, but according to investigators, beneath the surface, Ramos never left gang life behind. He remained tied to MS-13, also known as Mara Salvatrucha, a gang infamous for extreme violence, intimidation, and murders carried out across Central America and the United States. In San Francisco, Ramos had connections to the gang's 20th Street clique before later moving to Contra Costa County and associating with another MS-13-linked group known as Pasadena Loco Sureños. Then came another missed warning sign. In 2006, a former MS-13 leader who had become an FBI informant told federal agents that Ramos had allegedly murdered a 21-year-old gang member named Rolando Chino Valladares in San Francisco's Mission District. The information reached investigators, but nothing happened. No arrest, no charges, no intervention. And then came March 30th, 2008, just 3 months before the Bolognia murders. Police officers pulled Ramos over during a traffic stop because his vehicle had illegally tinted windows and no visible license plate. Inside the car with him was another man named Eric Lopez. During the search, officers discovered a firearm connected to a double homicide investigation. Both Ramos and Lopez were documented by authorities as active MS-13 members. At that moment, San Francisco Sheriff's deputies contacted Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or commonly known as ICE, asking whether federal authorities wanted Ramos held in custody because of his immigration status and gang ties. ICE declined to detain him. Meanwhile, prosecutors later dropped the gun-related charges against Ramos, arguing there wasn't enough evidence to prove he knew the weapon was inside the vehicle. And that decision would soon come under intense national scrutiny, because only 3 months later, on June 22, 2008, Tony Bolognia and 3 of his sons were driving home from a family barbecue in San Francisco. What happened next would shock the city, ignite a political firestorm across the country, and become one of the most infamous gang-related murders in San Francisco history. On the morning of June 22, 2008, violence broke out in San Francisco's Mission District. At the time, it had absolutely nothing to do with the Bolognia family. They weren't there. They didn't know the people involved. They weren't connected to gangs or crime in any way. But before the day was over, that violence would reach them anyway. A man named Marvin Medina, who investigators later said had ties to MS-13, was shot in what appeared to be a gang-related attack carried out by members of the rival Norteño gang. Medina survived, but in gang culture, survival doesn't end the conflict. It often escalates it. That shooting lit the fuse for retaliation. According to investigators, Edwin Ramos received word about the attack not long after it happened, and almost immediately, he went looking for revenge. Prosecutors later argued that Ramos drove through San Francisco's Excelsior district already expecting violence, searching for anyone he believed might be connected to the Norteños. That's what makes what happened next so horrifying. The Bolognia family had just exited the highway and were heading home after spending the day at a family barbecue in Fairfield. But somewhere during that drive, Ramos saw their vehicle and decided they were targets. Maybe it was the route they were taking. Maybe it was the color of the car. Maybe it was how someone inside was dressed. Investigators never found a logical reason. What they did find was that Ramos believed that the Bolognia family were rival gang members, and he never stopped to question that assumption. Ramos opened fire, sending bullets tearing into the Bolognia family's car within seconds. Tony Bolognia was killed. Beside him, his 20-year-old son Michael was also killed. Inside the vehicle, everything turned into chaos almost instantly. Glass exploded everywhere. Screams filled the car. What had been a normal drive home suddenly became a nightmare they couldn't escape from. The youngest son in the car was also struck by gunfire and critically wounded, but somehow survived. Matthew Bolognia, only 16 years old, was rushed to San Francisco General Hospital in critical condition. Doctors fought to save him, but the damage was too severe. 2 days later, on June 24th, he died from his injuries. In the span of moments, 3 members of the same family were gone. Not because they were involved in crime, not because they were targeted personally, but because a gang member made a deadly mistake and decided to act on it without hesitation. The murders shocked San Francisco almost immediately. Even in a city familiar with gang violence, this felt different. A father and his sons had been mistaken for rivals and executed while simply driving home through their own neighborhood. 3 days after the murders, on June 25, 2008, police arrested Edwin Ramos at his home in El Sobrante. He was 21 years old, and authorities booked him without bail. What followed the arrests wasn't just another criminal trial. It became something much bigger, a public reckoning that forced San Francisco to answer difficult questions about its own policies, its justice system, and the warnings that many people believed had been ignored. As journalists dug deeper into Edwin Ramos's past, the story became even more alarming. Reports revealed that Ramos wasn't some unknown suspect who suddenly appeared out of nowhere. Authorities already knew who he was. He had prior convictions. He was a documented member of MS-13. There had been earlier arrests, gang-related incidents, and even an FBI tip connecting him to a previous murder investigation. Then there was the March 2008 traffic stop involving another MS-13 member and a firearm later linked to a double homicide. And yet, despite all of that, Ramos had remained free. That's when attention shifted toward San Francisco's sanctuary city policy. At the time, San Francisco operated under laws that limited cooperation between local officials and federal immigration authorities. The idea behind the policy was rooted in trust. City leaders believed undocumented immigrants would be more willing to report crimes, cooperate with police, and seek help if they didn't fear automatic deportation. Supporters argued that it protected vulnerable communities and improved public safety overall. But after the Bolognia murders, critics argued that the policy had also created dangerous blind spots. Because in practice, Edwin Ramos, a known gang member with a violent criminal history, had avoided federal immigration enforcement multiple times while living in San Francisco. His juvenile convictions were not referred to immigration authorities. Earlier warnings about his gang activity didn't lead to removal from the country. And during the March traffic stop, even after sheriff's deputies contacted ICE about him, federal authorities ultimately declined to detain him. So when the public learned those details after the murders, outrage spread quickly. For many people, the question became impossible to ignore. Could this tragedy have been prevented? Tony Bologna's widow, Danielle Bologna, spoke publicly and directly about where she placed the blame. She believed the sanctuary city policy had played a major role in the deaths of her husband and sons. Just weeks after the murders, in August 2008, she filed a civil lawsuit against the city of San Francisco, arguing that the city's handling of Ramos and its policies had contributed to what happened. The political pressure became intense almost immediately. Then, less than 2 weeks after the shooting, San Francisco Mayor Gavin Newsom quietly changed part of the city's sanctuary policy. On July 2, 2008, the city amended the rules to allow undocumented juvenile felons to be referred to federal immigration authorities for possible deportation. The timing was impossible to ignore. To many observers, the change felt like an acknowledgement that something in the system had failed. City officials may not have said it directly, but the sudden policy shift spoke loudly on its own. Eventually, the courts ruled in favor of San Francisco in Danielle Bologna's civil lawsuit. Judges determined that the city could not legally be held responsible because officials had no specific warning that Ramos posed a direct threat to the Bologna family themselves. Legally, the city won. But for Danielle Bologna, that ruling didn't change the reality she had to live with. She had lost her husband and 2 of her sons in a matter of seconds. And even after the lawsuit ended, she continued speaking publicly about the case, determined to make sure people never forgot what happened to her family. Danielle Bologna had buried her husband and 2 of her sons. Her surviving son, who had been shot in the same attack, had to live with having watched his father and brothers murdered in front of him. The family that remained was shattered in ways that no court ruling, no settlement, and no conviction would ever fully repair. Authorities placed Danielle and her surviving children in a witness protection program. They moved out of San Francisco. They were given new identities. A family that had been rooted in that city for decades was erased from it, not by choice, but by necessity, because the man who had killed their family was connected to one of the most dangerous gangs in the country, and the danger didn't end with his arrest. In the years that followed, Danielle became an unflinching voice for victims of violence and for accountability in immigration enforcement. She appeared in court. She gave interviews. She stood in front of the man who had killed her family and said what needed to be said. She pushed, loudly and consistently, for Ramos to face the death penalty. Then District Attorney Kamala Harris refused. Harris had pledged never to seek capital punishment in any case and held to that pledge here. Danielle was furious. She was not the only one. The legal process moved slowly. Preliminary hearings began in June 2009. The surviving Bolognia son testified about what he witnessed that day. A gang expert testified that Ramos had believed the Bolognas were norteños. Witnesses connected Ramos to the attack through text messages, testimony, and a confession to another MS-13 member. There was also a second figure in this case who took years to fully account for. Wilfredo Flaco Reyes was identified by investigators as a leader within MS-13 and a man who, according to testimony, had a role in directing what happened on June 22nd. Ramos himself initially tried to place the blame on Reyes, claiming it was Reyes who fired the shots. Investigators disputed this account. One of the witnesses in the case, Marvin Medina, the man who had been shot in the Mission District hours before the Bologna killings, made things significantly worse for himself by lying repeatedly on the stand before eventually admitting he had perjured himself multiple times. Medina pleaded guilty to 3 counts of perjury. He was sentenced to probation. Reyes evaded law enforcement for years. He was eventually arrested in Salisbury, North Carolina in 2012 and extradited to California. He initially pleaded not guilty, but in 2015, Reyes pleaded guilty to criminal street gang membership and firing at an occupied vehicle. He was sentenced to 10 years in state prison, 10 years, for a man connected to the coordinated murder of 3 innocent people. Danielle Bologna watched that sentence handed down. It is not difficult to imagine what she felt. As for Edwin Ramos, in May 2012, a jury convicted him of all 3 murders and the attempted murder of the surviving son. On June 11, 2012, he was sentenced to 3 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole, 183 years. He appealed. In August 2014, the California Court of Appeal upheld his convictions while ordering a minor sentencing correction. Edwin Ramos will die in prison. One of the most powerful moments in the entire legal saga surrounding this case came at sentencing when Danielle Bologna and the mother of one of Ramos's other victims stood and faced him directly in that courtroom. Danielle had spent 4 years waiting for this moment. 4 years of legal proceedings, of media coverage, of having to explain over and over again what had been taken from her. She looked at the man who had murdered her husband and her sons, and she spoke. This is what it means to have a system fail a family, not just in the moment of the crime, but in the years before it. In every decision that allowed Edwin Ramos to remain in the country, to accumulate convictions, to walk out of juvenile facilities and right back into gang life, to stand next to a man with a murder weapon in a car 3 months before a massacre and face no serious consequences. Every one of those moments was a door that the system left open, and a father and 2 of his sons walked through one of them on their way home from a barbecue. The Bologna murders became one of the most cited examples in the national debate over sanctuary city policies, and that debate did not stay quiet for long. In July 2008, members of the Minuteman Project, a citizen border patrol organization, held protests at San Francisco City Hall, demanding Mayor Newsom's resignation and calling for an end to the sanctuary policy. The New York Times published a piece that same summer naming the Ramos case as one of several serious failures of the San Francisco policy. The case stayed politically alive for years. When Kamala Harris ran for vice president in 2020 and became the Democratic presidential nominee in 2024, her handling of the Ramos case became a flashpoint in national political advertising. A super PAC supporting Donald Trump ran ads in the 2024 presidential campaign, specifically criticizing Harris for declining to prosecute Ramos on gun charges after the March 2008 traffic stop and for not seeking the death penalty. Harris's opponents argued she had missed multiple opportunities to intervene before the massacre and then refused to pursue the harshest available punishment after it. Whether you find that political framing fair or not depends on what you believe about prosecutorial discretion, capital punishment, and the structural limits of a DA's authority over ICE decisions. What is not in dispute is that the system failed the Bologna family at multiple levels, in multiple ways, over the course of several years, and that 3 innocent people paid for it with their lives. There is a coda to this story, and it is one of the saddest things imaginable. After losing her husband and 2 of her sons in a single afternoon, after spending years in witness protection with a new identity in a new city, after fighting the city of San Francisco in court and losing, after watching Edwin Ramos sentenced to life and Wilfredo Reyes given 10 years, after doing all of it publicly and without ever giving up, Danielle Bolognia rebuilt whatever she could of a life. She had a daughter named Francesca, who was 25 years old in the summer of 2023. On August 14, 2023, Danielle Bolognia, now 62, and her daughter Francesca were killed in an automobile accident in Northern California. A woman who had survived the worst thing a mother can survive, who had fought for justice for her family for 15 years, who had raised her children under assumed names in a city that was not her own. Gone in an instant, in an accident on a road, 15 years after her life was first shattered. The family that the Bolognia murders had left behind, already reduced to shadows of what it was diminished again, silently, without the cameras and the headlines that had surrounded every earlier chapter of this story. Tony, Michael, and Matthew Bolognia were murdered on June 22, 2008. Danielle Bolognia died on August 14, 2023. Francesca Bolognia died the same day. So I want to know your thoughts. Was the sanctuary city policy responsible for what happened to the Bolognia family? Should the DA have sought the death penalty? And what do you make of Wilfredo Reyes walking out of prison after 10 years while the family he helped destroy never got to walk anywhere again? Leave your thoughts in the comments. If this case affected you, please hit the like button and subscribe. These victims deserve to be remembered, and stories like this one deserve to be told. Thank you for watching. We'll see you in the next one.